our in-person meetup for the Boston Healthcare Cloud community. It's the last Wednesday of the month. And this is Paul Swider. I'm the presenter. I'm just going to do a quick introduction and then minimize the screen and really spend a lot of time just in demo and in conversation. But please try to follow along. So just quickly, a little bit about our group. Currently sponsored by Real Activity and also Microsoft. Microsoft sponsors us with space, and Real Activity sponsors us with sushi. That should be here any minute. And our two big sponsors at this time. But actually, what's really fascinating, I should update the group that we are actually starting to hear from some other groups that are talking to us about sponsorship. So that's certainly exciting. So the primary mission of the group is to foster interest and innovation in healthcare. It's really that simple. Our thought is, by showing people how to implement innovative, newer technologies and sort of getting beyond the hype and showing real world implementations, that this would lift all of healthcare, if you will. And so this is essentially the mission of the group. And so we do this by attracting great speakers. If you look at our links are here for the Discord group and also for the user group. If you check out our past meetups, you'll see we just have an incredible lineup of speakers, and a lot that aren't even there because we don't record every session like we did recently as we were going through the last couple of years. So with that said, now I'm going to actually transition. So that's the group, that's me. So now let's move into talking more about the content. Okay. Forgive me, we're going to go past here. And actually, let's start on this slide. And now we can actually, let's pick up that conversation that we were just having before I started the stream. So we started to talk about some of the complexities about deploying generative AI. And I was explaining how one of the things we've been working on that helped us put together this session was this idea of helping people get out in front of generative AI. And so the way that we do that is with something we call the Wheelhouse Center of Excellence. And a big part of that is it is a private instance of OpenAI and a ChatGPT client. And that's what we're going to dive into today. But going beyond just like the value of it as private chat, because I think that's should be pretty clear to most folks now. And so we'll spend some time talking about what those next steps are as well as I go through the session here. And so just to, let me just start. I will go through a couple quick slides. Again, I promise this would be mostly demo, but we'll do a couple. A quick note, we'll be going through the Azure OpenAI service. We'll be looking at this concept of copilots or AI assistants, if you will, and private large models that we can use for a development architecture. And so that's sort of where we're going in the conversation today. And again, though, most of it being demo driven. Excuse the charity slides. I gave the very first presentation of this for the victims in Slovenia after flooding, and so we still have their slides in there. So just real quick, it's worth noting in the beginning, we've been through this for a while now, right? I mean, people like to talk about how AI has been around for a long time, but the reality is it's just like in the last 10 years that we've really started doing like what I would say meaningful stuff, right? With our friends in big tech, including, my friends at Microsoft. Some might say that early on they went all in on the marketing behind AI, right? But early on, I think in the decade, it was really more of a focus just on, it was machine learning, right? And getting our predictions better and doing that through training, right? Training and just sort of all sorts of technology around that. And so, and then, but that did shift a little bit recently, and we know this now. Of course, we're about 6 to 12 months into this, depending on how you look at it. But now we have this sort of new flavor of AI, if you will, that folks are calling generative AI. And there's a ton of content about how the networks work and how you build them. And some folks will get very sophisticated and even start showing off some math and stuff like that. And just for the record, we're actually not going to do that in this session. So what we want to do is look at real world applications, like what practically can we do with this. And so especially specifically from a software architecture perspective. So I'm a software engineer about 30 years. A little bit about me. I probably should have done an introduction. I'll save it for a break, since we're streaming. But so my perspective is more from a software perspective. And so I think it's fair to say that one of the interesting things that's happened is this evolution of what are being labeled these foundation models that we can use as building blocks for applications ourselves. And that's specifically what we'll be looking at today. And so we're going to look at how we can use OpenAI, Azure AI, Hugging Face, and in some of the complexities and some of the considerations, even from a governance perspective, like from a leadership perspective, but certainly from a technology perspective as well. Again, we're going to assume that the network is there. So I'm not, again, there's a ton of presentations about the hallucinations and grounding. So I'm just going to spare you that for this presentation. Okay, we've heard this stuff. We know what it is. Here's another way that I like to think about this that might help. I'm mentally going back to like the early and mid 90s, where there used to be a very clear distinction between IT pro stuff and software developer stuff. And I remember we used to tell jokes, and basically we used to say, well, you could always see the IT pro folks. They were under the desk plugging in the cables, and then you had the software folks, right? And I sort of feel like that's worth revisiting today, because I think you'll see when I start my demo. As a matter of fact, I'll do that now. When we actually start to look at what this stuff looks like in Azure, like if you actually go look at it, there's certainly this. But by the way, if there's a GitHub repo for this session, I'll share it again later, and I'll put this link in the description so that everybody has it. And now we'll move on to Azure OpenAI Studio. So what you're looking at here is Azure OpenAI Studio. So this is just to go to Azure, you go to portal.azure.com, right? And that brings you to the main portal of Azure. So now you can also go to oai.azure.com, and what that will do is bring you to Azure Studio. So now this is where, going back to the conversation about sort of IT pro folks and developer folks, and then I guess for the purpose of this, where we are today, fast forward 30 years later, I would add data science people as well, right? So I think in all fairness, we have to acknowledge them if we're going to talk about AI, right? So the data science folks might end up in here a little bit as well, but candidly, probably not. Like so we're doing this again in the real world right now. And the pattern that we find is our data scientists, they're working in Jupyter notebooks, right? So I have them testing code in Jupyter notebooks. And then when they get something that works, they're writing Python in Jupyter notebooks. And you'll see why when I start talking about Hugging Face and stuff like this. And then once that code is good enough, then that Python code can be moved out, and it can be moved into an API. It can be published up into Azure, right? Now, the same is true with models. So the Azure OpenAI Studio allows you to manage the models as well. And this is where I sort of feel like this is a little bit IT pro-ish. Like you literally are, like, especially if they're foundation models, because it's not like you're really building the models or adjusting the weights or anything. Like you literally are just sort of like getting this instance configured for your tenant in Azure, right? You're securing it, you're adding your Active Directory stuff, etc. So in my mind, there's a lot of the IT pro stuff that goes on in here. And we can see that actually if we click through here. Yeah, please, sushi anytime. Yeah, you can just drop it up there. Thanks. So if we look at this, here's a great example. So for example, one of the first things that you would do to get started is you need to create a deployment. So you can see here, I have, I actually have a model deployed for this presentation. And in this case, it's the 3.5 version. So I'm not actually consuming the GPT-4 version here. In this demo, it's the 3.5 version. And so, what happened is this thing got here because somebody created a new deployment, right? So somebody came in here. Again, this is where I sort of put my IT pro hat on. The data science stuff is done. They did it in the Jupyter notebook. You have that code. Maybe now you need some not only foundation models, but some machine learning models as well. And so you're going to create those deployments in here using Azure OpenAI Studio. So that statement that I just made is huge if we dissect it, right? Because I'm like, wait, for multiple models, like, what are you talking about, Paul? Like, I thought this was just OpenAI, right? That type of thing. And so no, what's really cool is that Microsoft is doing their best to keep an open model when it comes to this stuff. And so them, as well as I think most software engineers, accept that we will be living in a world of multi-model applications and multi-model deployments across organizations. That's the way we go. And as developers, we need to sort of stitch that all together, right? That's what a lot of this is about. So, you can expect to see a lot of deployments in here. Is my point. You might have some that are in test. You might have some that are not, right? And so handling all of that stuff again, you may have heard the term ML ops as well. I think that you're going to have some of that come into play here. Those types of folks, IT pro folks, and then possibly the data science folks. They may need to load up some tests for different things. So once you create a new deployment, then what you need to do is you can start testing it. So it really can be just as easy as going into the playground here. And then you can go ahead and go ahead and just start chatting, right? So tell me a funny joke about what? Autumn? Why did the Scarecrow win an award? Because he was outstanding in his field. So, funny joke, great job. But, by now you probably have a sense of all the computer science stuff that's going on in the background, right? The playground that we're testing here, this is just a chat window that's passing our prompt through to, in this case, it's the instance of the OpenAI network, and returning back a response. And so there are some interesting things that you can do. I don't want to jump ahead right now, but I will call your attention to the Add Your Data tab. So that's where some of this stuff starts to get really interesting when you look at connecting, corporate data sets, right, and what you can do, especially in terms of analytics. And then there's also some parameters and different things that you can tweak for the tests and the deployments. And then in here, there's a new, there's a section for completions. And so this allows you to really get granular with the things like temperature, max length for tokens, etc. This is sort of fascinating. I just learned this the other day. We want to hear something interesting about temperature and these models in general. So, and this is up on YouTube, by the way. So I learned this by watching the chief AI officer for Spotify. And really fascinating. I think it's actually the best talk I've seen so far on generative AI, and just a really bright guy, and it was really well done. And and obviously he has some real world use cases in Spotify, and what they're doing with playlists and whatnot. But essentially, what he said and what he shared is that these it's not really accurate to think of this as this generative AI, especially like the language model, OpenAI, as guessing the next word, if you will, right? So you hear people talk about this often. As a matter of fact, I was saying this for months. I was like, well, remember, it's all it's doing is predicting what the next word is, right? And it's doing that with hopefully with the degree of accuracy. But actually, technically, it turns out what's happening underneath the scenes is what they've done is they've actually assigned a unique number to each of the roughly 600,000 words in the language, and then that's how they then start to look for the patterns in the numbers. So it's just like the same machine learning, right? We're still looking for patterns in numbers, but now when we find the patterns, they're corresponding back to other things. In this case, it's language. We've also seen where it's doing some interesting stuff with encoders, and so that's fascinating in itself.
So a company like Spotify is going to have its own corpus of like prompts, search things that people have entered. How would you adjust your stock, fully trained model with, corpus?
Yeah. So what you're describing, I think, will fall a little bit more under fine tuning. So I just wanted to pass on the question for a minute.
Okay.
But I think I see what. Let me tell you about temperature, though, because it in part will help, I think, where your head is going with some of this stuff.
All right.
So if we assume that that everything I said is true, that we assign a number to each of the 600,000 words, and then we have a mathematical algorithm that mathematically predicts what the next word should be, it should always be the same word, right? Statistically, it's impossible for it not to be. And as a matter of fact, in theory, it is. So in theory, if you have zero temperature, what will happen is the model will return the word that it really thinks has the highest probability of being correct. As you adjust that temperature, what happens is it starts going up for the ones that are maybe not the ideal candidate, but they're in the range. This is where you get into some of the semantic capabilities in vector databases and doing vector searches, right, and the returns and whatnot. So, I lost my screen there for a minute. Hold on, folks. Okay, great. So, so then what happens is you adjust the temperature and thus the generative AI, because now you are generating stuff that didn't exist, right? If you always go for the exact, the best probability, then you will get duplicate stuff returned back from prompts if the temperature truly is set to 0. So you can double check all this. Again, I learned this from watching the chief of AI of Spotify. It's up on YouTube. I thought it was a brilliant talk. And he took about 10 minutes to explain that. I was like, gosh, he just did it in such an eloquent way. It made sense. Like I didn't realize, I guess I missed the part that they were assigning numbers to words, and that was helping the patterns. Again, I'm looking at this more from a software architecture perspective, not necessarily, data science, although, it interests me. So so that's this. So that's Azure OpenAI Studio. We deploy our models here, and then the other thing that's interesting to note while we're in here that is very powerful, and that is we can secure this deployment in Azure as well, right? So if I go to portal.azure.com and I go to my service, the actual service, you see where I have this networking section and of course the security section. And so what's really cool is you can secure your models not only at the Active Directory level, but also at the endpoint level and at the network level, which is probably most optimum depending on what you're trying to do. And so why would we want to do this? Why would we want to deploy an instance of a large language model? Let's start to look at this Copilot. custom. So this is a custom Copilot. Microsoft has been releasing. They released a security one, the sales one, and now they just released. There's one in Windows now. Apparently, it's available for preview, and Microsoft 365 one that everybody's looking forward to. And so this follows that the model that Microsoft is using for developing their copilots. You can get this sample code from a GitHub repo. So if you Google semantic-kernel and Microsoft, you'll find this repo. There's also a link to this repo on the GitHub page for this session as well. So if you're finding this after the recording and you're in the description, there should be a link there as well. And so it's this version we use for presentations. So it hasn't been modified a lot. It has a couple of minor modifications, but it's pretty much what's in the semantic-kernel repo. And so the semantic-kernel repo has several sample applications, and the ChatGPT client is just one of them. Okay. This ChatGPT client can be pointed to Azure OpenAI. So that deployment that I just showed you, remember I put my IT pro hat on, I went in there, I was like, we got a network, it's deployed, it's secured, nobody can get to it. Okay, now I'm putting my software architecture hat on, my software architect hat on. And so what's really cool about this sample application from a software architecture perspective is it can scale, and it's the real deal. And so what I mean by this is it's a multi-tier application. And so you're looking at the front tier now, which is the chat client. And then notice this is Node.js and React, and notice that I'm logged in, I am authenticated into the application. And then what's happening is the Node.js app. So I have this running in terminal. This is actually the API for the sample app. So there's a sample API, a middle tier that comes with this. That's in Visual Studio. So the API, the middle tier, the middle layers in Visual Studio, and that's what's running here in this terminal window. So I just did a .NET run on that project directory just so it's spun up the API. And then what happens is then you can load up the Node app. It'll look to make sure that the API exists, and then as long as it does, it'll go ahead and connect. Now, of course, you also have to configure the middle tier, the API, to find the backend, which in this case is going to be the large language model and anything else that you integrate with the large language models, right? So that's what you're looking at here. So it's a pretty fascinating architecture. What's the term they use nowadays? You have the front end developers, back end developers, and full stack. Full stack, yeah, that's what they would call this nowadays. But really, I think a step beyond full stack. And so before we start to talk about, why is this interesting stuff, it is a user group, and it's a very technical meeting. I'm a software architect, so I'm going to stay very technical for a while, okay, if you don't mind. So one of the things that we should stop and talk about right now is that, like, what is one of the fundamental key differences between apps that we have built historically. So just think of your typical Node.js apps where you've got web pages that talk to stuff, right? And going back in history, what's the difference between those apps and the apps that we're looking at here? This is what I would call a modern user experience for an app or a platform. As a matter of fact, I can't show you the other version of this because it's under NDA, but one of the reasons what started us down this path 9 months ago is we decided to completely rewrite our user experience for our enterprise platform. It's now just a Copilot. There's very little else to the user experience. There's a mobile app, and then there's a Copilot. And that's replacing SharePoint sites, analytics, SQL Server reports. I mean, like a lot of stuff, right? So there's that, right? But then if we think about these traditional apps, like what's one of the most basic things that you have to do when you start building these apps? Like really the minute you introduce a second page or a second thing, what do you have to do? You have to track state, right? You have to track the state between the pages or between the stuff on the pages. And typically with the web app, we do that using cookies, right? And different techniques like that. We stuff them into files, and then we know how that happens. We've been doing it for years. So what's different here is, we still need to track the state of our application that's built on the large language model, but the state is tracked a little bit differently. Okay, so what I mean by that is here the state in this chat application are the different chats that I start, right? And so you've seen this. You do this on ChatGPT all day long, right? You say, new conversation. They call it conversations. Here we're just calling it chat for right now. New conversation, and it starts and it remembers these, right? When I close ChatGPT and I open it, and it brings back that conversational state, and then it puts it in the left hand pane here. But what's fundamentally different is it's treating that conversational state as vector data, and that's where this new excitement around vector databases and semantic search comes in. So what happens is we're actually, if you look at the source code, this conversation stuff is actually being persisted to a vector database, and the sample code is just on the file system. So it's a vector database on the file system. But now you can, just by tweaking some parameters, of course, it can be a vector database, Pinecone, or Cosmos DB, a vector database of choice, insert database of choice. So that gets interesting, right? And then if you think about it, that's really where a lot of the magic happens with ChatGPT, right? So, because think about it, again, just go taking it back to first principles, what we already know, like the basic stuff, like software has multiple tiers. There's 3 tiers. There's the user experience, there's the API layer, there's the backend stuff, right? And we know that the front end, the user experience, obviously can make or break an app, right? And what I would submit is that part of the huge success of ChatGPT is the front end user experience, the design in the front end. The large language model was built a while ago, like transformers. It's been about 12, 24 months, right? Like people were working on that stuff, etc. But it was really putting all these moving parts together, like the large language model with a vector database, coming up with the idea that you're going to take those conversations and you're going to store them as vector data. So now we can do different searches, right? Because if you think about the cookie data and the data that we store in the traditional apps, that stuff is typically key pair, right? Like go get this cookie and get this value, right? And it's going to give you the specific value. But when we're searching and we're storing and we're trying to do intelligent stuff with conversations, we don't want to do that type of search. We want to be able to do a search where we can say, like, is it about the same thing? Is it close? Is it in the ballpark, right? Like, and you can see that now after we've all had some time, right, to play with these tools a little bit, ChatGPT and stuff like that. As I'm explaining this to you now, hopefully some light bulbs are going off, and you're picturing the interface. So essentially, that's what we're looking at. Looking at here is an implementation of that code. And so again, this is up and running. The other cool thing that's really nice about this, by the way, let me just show you this before we go too much further, is it even has the plugins capability enabled. And so plugins basically allow us to extend large language models. I think hopefully beyond just OpenAI and GPT-4. It's supposed to be this sort of a open standard, sort of like browser extensions, if you will. But the idea is basically you can tie in plugins to the chat client. So a plugin, if you could touch it, it's just an API that's registered with ChatGPT. That's all it is. And so the plugin, maybe you type in, ask Paul, right? That's the name of your plugin. And when you start the prompt with ask Paul, then ChatGPT or OpenAI will take it and they will pass it to your API with whatever parameters, that you have set up and you specified ahead of time. Okay, what do you think so far? Questions?
I was a little bit concerned about the informational thing at the top on the previous screen.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
why?
The premise is...
Here, I'll help you. Don't be concerned.
So I was just wondering, like, if we're trying to do an on-premise solution to search over our documents.
Yep.
Well, I don't necessarily want to share with Microsoft my documents or my searches.
Yep.
So the little pop-up that said, like, in fact, you guys intend to do that is a concern.
Yeah. Well, you should be very happy with Microsoft then. They should be your vendor of choice. Because boy, do they like regulation and rules.
All right.
Let me just tell you that. They have spent nothing but the last 6 months not deploying AI, and I do hope they hear me say this because they need to get this standard feedback, but they've been deploying regulations and rules. And they really haven't been deploying much more, quite frankly. It's a bit disappointing. And a good example of that is what you just saw. Because all that is they just wasted an engineer's time to make sure that he included a little banner so that we could all have this conversation about responsible AI. So you can literally just close it, or in all seriousness, now I'll put my serious hat on. Okay, so responsible AI, very serious thing, especially in healthcare. Especially when we look at things like social determinants of health. This is how we can make wise decisions about treatment, make sure that we improve the ultimate quality of the outcomes in healthcare. And so the reality is, in order to do that, we're going to be using lots of sensitive data. We should take that very seriously. One of the really cool things that Microsoft is doing to lead the pack in this space is if we go back to the studio, notice they've actually started adding the ability now where you can even add additional content filtering, on top. So you have the ability to do filtering on top of all of the safety that they build into their, into their networking capabilities, if you will. And then you, again, remember, you sort of your IT pro hat on when you're in here. You're deploying the networks. You're thinking about security. Hopefully, you're thinking about responsible AI. As a matter of fact, I would submit this is all an ML ops type person's job, right? Has the model been compromised? Has it been tested, right? And all that. I mean, in all seriousness, that should be happening here. There is another product that Microsoft has called the Responsible AI Dashboard that would also help with a lot of this stuff. Basically, the strategy there is they're preemptively looking at models and making sure that they're not harmful ahead of time, like before they actually get into into the workflow. These would be models that you're creating, your own custom models. So, and candidly, a lot of the security models still being written. So I don't want to, I don't want to pretend like there's much more than that. That's sort of what there is. It's a lot more than what anybody else really has at this point. That's for sure. Just the fact that we can have a secure chat, right? Well, I mean, in all fairness, that's not really true, because you can also do this with open source, because Meta made their large language model open source, right? And Google's made some great progress with their stuff too. And it's worth noting, especially because it's a healthcare user group, like Google MedPalm is definitely emerging as the leader in the clinical space, like in the clinical language side so far that I've seen anyway. And by the way, Oracle's doing amazing work as well. Like I think the top 3 in healthcare are Oracle, Microsoft, and the one I just mentioned, I already forgot, Google, the biggest one. So anyway, I didn't mean to sound facetious at the beginning, but it's a sore subject for me, as you can tell, the software development. Well, especially because you heard me say I'm going to Southeast Asia soon next week, and I'm talking about this stuff. And so I look at other countries like Japan, where they've adopted an exact opposite model, where they've been very open and embracing of the technology and have decided that it's better for the good of people. So they, are making adjustments in what ways they need to. And then you see the path that we've gone down the last 6 months, and you have to ask yourself how much of that is regulatory capture type strategy, right, versus reality. But the problem is now is everybody gets spooked so quickly with social media. So all you got to do is say, AI is nasty, boo, and the whole world shudders, like within 24 hours. It's like so crazy, the world we live in today. But so anyway, yeah, super cool stuff. I suggest, you want to take a quick break and we can load up on some sushi, and then I'll go into the second part of the presentation where we'll talk about connecting it to corporate data and the challenges of connecting to corporate data. Cool. Okay. So I'll pause.
So what kind of application is
this? This is Node.js.
Okay. And you're using backend OpenAI?
Yeah, this is the application architecture. So this front end here is Node.js. It's actually this web app here. And then the API, the middle tier, is Visual Studio. And that's what's in this folder here. And then it's connecting to the middle tier, the API, the Visual Studio tier is connecting to this deployment. This one right here. Yeah. And it's really easy to set up, candidly. It's you just need the API key. You set up the API key, and then it's
just like the OpenAI as well. So.
Yeah.
We have been using it with OpenAI directly.
Yeah. No, same thing. Like 6 months ago, we expected everybody to be here, like right about now. So we've been working a lot more on interoperability, fine tuning, like semantic search, those type of capabilities. So we still think we're 6 months out in front of people, but I'm sure there are other people that will see the same. How's the food look tonight?
It's pretty good.
You guys do a great job.
Hello. I'm John. You next question?
I think that's not acceptable. There should only be one John at a time. So what do you do at UMass Boston?
I teach students.
What do you teach?
Security and database.
Or in reality, you teach them about lack of security in the database.
Yeah, database security. What do I do?
Again,
No.
yeah, very
No,
informal.
I'm an independent contractor. So
So one of the integrations with Jira.
I
Yeah.
have,
What is
for,
what is like their
I guess that's
state at the moment?
I don't know, because I don't use Jira, so I don't have a reason to know. You know how it is. We're all so busy nowadays. It's like I just am paying attention to stuff that's on our radar.
By a much bigger company now, so I'm back to being a contractor.
But
they don't want me anymore, and then I'll probably
that said,
not doing much of anything.
I've heard there are some really cool examples that they are doing some neat stuff with issues tracking,
So far, these days the market is good.
and being able to
I don't know.
interpret. You can imagine these busy repos where you have, lots of tasks being created,
Right.
or support departments where you might have lots of tasks, I guess, as well. Right? It could be really helpful to be able to just make a call and have it really truly understand what somebody is asking, right? I mean, we've been trying to do that forever, but it's never really been effective. And you can tell that now because after you get used to using ChatGPT, when you go into your car and you have to use Google or whatever, it feels dumb. It's like, why don't you understand me? You know? You know, the older version, the Microsoft one too, they all seem antiquated now. The cognitive services.
So there's really interesting demo on Twitter on that. There's
So what do you use for
startups that
your,
have like
demo
layers
database?
on top of ChatGPT,
Yeah.
but they're using like the link back facility. So
So,
you know,
Mostly it's
they're having a conversation through their filter underneath is ChatGPT, but as
Yeah, I've
they
been to
give
that
you an
many
answer, the answer is backed by links into
So you
data
use any
sources.
MySQL or
And that's the sort of thing where
people can go and
you know, you get the search gives you a conversational answer, but it gives you a link into you know, a body of documents, right? So you can, you know,
So,
like say like,
But the.
tell me about
data,
you know, the jury tickets that
your
show
students,
this
or
cluster
your courses.
having incident, right?
Yeah.
And, like,
People are gonna be
ideally,
administrators.
It would
Yeah,
give you links to those tickets,
You're
right?
not necessarily getting.
Mhm.
all-
Rather than, you know, a conversation. Like,
Yeah.
yes, your
So
customer
you
is
wouldn't
very
look at
stable.
the technical
Right,
details of how-
That's
Yep.
not very
How
useful.
do
I
you
want
implement
the links to the
secure, how do you actually write
documents.
code to make?
Yeah, I think I can see a
Allow
lot
for
of
security.
great use cases for them.
Mhm, mhm.
So, okay.
And I think
And so
Microsoft
you're
has some
assuming this
hookins
from
too
a
for
healthcare perspective,
uh,
all the security holes that this thing's gonna introduce.
you know,
I
DevOps,
just want to see
We-
what's going on in
the boards and whatnot.
Yeah.
Okay.
So how the heck do we do that? So, yep. Too much to learn.
What's the event about in Southeast Asia? I think,
What's that?
is it a conference
So,
or?
are you-
Yeah, just a couple one-day events at the different Microsoft offices in Manila,
Okay.
Malaysia, and they might be the one in Singapore might be at a university. Sometimes they're not always at the local Microsoft office. I know the one in Manila and Kuala Lumpur will be at the Microsoft offices. But no, Manila's actually starting to do some really great stuff with healthcare. They it's really from my perspective again, like it's more from the software architecture, clinical informatics. It's a little more interesting because they don't really have systems yet. You know, like they don't know. Well, what? Hold on, let me rephrase. They don't have streaming by desktop too. I hope it wasn't too exciting. They don't have like centralized healthcare record, right? Like big deployments of electronic medical records, etc. And so that's interesting because if you know, as you know, if you don't have something, then you're in an interesting opportunity where you might even be able to leapfrog some of the folks that were a little bit were first. A good example of that I think of is like remember internet access in large parts of Africa, sort of leapfrog parts of the West via mobile networks, right? So we were connecting through the copper lines for the longest time, right? And they didn't really have any connectivity. It was very, very sad. So anyway, but then it actually was interesting, fascinating what happened. So they then of course came the mobile towers and they blanketed the continent with mobile networks. And I remember 10 years ago when I went to the top of Mount Kilimanjaro, we had a super fast data connection. Like we actually had somebody who was a sponsor that they paid for a little bit of our trip. So because they wanted us to hold the iPad and show it syncing the data, from the top of the mountain. And sure enough, we lost it obviously on the last day when you go up to summit, but all bets are off. You know what I mean? But all the way up, to the very end, we had fast connectivity. And so I might submit that, that we might see some of that same concepts evolve here as we're deploying and building our apps and connecting to corporate data. That's what I want to talk about next. So the easiest way to do this, but probably not the best, meaning like, I don't know if it's the best practice, but if you just wanted to really quickly test something, it's as easy as just going to the homepage of Studio, and then what you can do is you can just click on bring your own data, and then from here, what you can do is you can select a data source. So now, the interesting thing to note is that at this time, there's two options when you're using this technique, this pattern to connect to data. And that is first to use Azure Cognitive Search, which is actually really impressive and brilliant, in my opinion, from a software architecture perspective. The only caveat there is if you're building stuff on top of OpenAI, as we are, then you have to be careful about any expenses you incur if you go that route, right? So if you're doing like a more a commercialized type product, right? It's probably not a big deal. If you're already using Azure Cognitive Search, this is huge for you. If you were even thinking about using it, this is huge and should push you over the edge, in my opinion. And I don't say that stuff you loosely want to, especially when it comes to product SKUs and stuff. But I mean, the idea here is that with Azure Cognitive Search, you can do one of two things first. You can connect to an Azure SQL database. At this time, it's only an Azure SQL database. I haven't seen a way to do on-prem SQL. I'm sure it'll be there like next month or whatever, but right now there's not. And you can also connect it to blob storage, Azure Cognitive Search. And then you see here, you can also connect direct to blob storage, and you can also upload files. You can directly upload files right here. Now, the use case here where this gets interesting, and this is what you were alluding to in some of your questions, what you were describing, right? Which is, okay, we want to start to use natural language and large language models to help us find stuff in our data, right? And so in PDF files specifically, you said, I'm sorry, not data, you said content. Because I do like to make a distinction here between data and content. I know that can get very nuanced conversation, but let's pretend there is for now. Meaning data to me is the structured stuff, okay? Like think relational data, that type of stuff, right? And then content are your documents and your PDF files and all that stuff that people are generating, right? Think Office document stuff. And it is worth making the distinction as we're trying to learn this stuff, because if we're trying to build apps or extend our existing apps to use large language models and prompt engineering to get to corporate data, then there's two paths. There's the database and the structured data, and there's the content. And either one you can do through cognitive search. You can go direct to Azure Blob Storage, and then you would just fill that thing with PDF files or whatever you want to search. And then once you do that, you have effectively connected your data to those PDF files. So so now let's bring it down let's get real about it. So like everybody's going to be doing that. If they haven't already done it in 12 months, everybody that wants to do that is going to be doing that. They're going to be connecting OpenAI to their PDF files, right? But then that's really just like everything else, just a starting point, Because what I mean by that is then you have to start making sure that you still have to make sure you're delivering meaningful results back, and that's where fine tuning comes into play, right? So let's say, for example, I'm going to fill up Azure Blob Storage with contract data. All my contracts, I have 1 million contracts. I'm a large company. I got 1 million contracts. Dump them all in Blob Storage. And we'll start asking it questions, right? Show me the contracts that are the worst, or whatever, right? Which ones can you make better, right? And but the problem is that stuff's generic. At a certain point, you're going to want to get very specific, right? You're going to want to say, show me all contracts for doctors that were initiated in 2021. Something like this, right? That's realistically the type. Or show me, the RVU data for Dr. X, Y, and Z for this month, right? What was their RVU billing type data, right? And so that's where this notion of fine tuning comes into play. And so essentially what you're doing when you're fine tuning is you are coming up with what you think are prompts people are going to use. And by the way, you could train people to use certain prompts too, right? So you can fine tune your model, and then you can deploy training to your users. And so then so what you do is you supply what you're expecting is a prompt, and then what the return should be. And so you can go through and fine tune the model. So remember, that's just one example of why you should have some caution when you're seeing sort of like the hype demos where people are like, oh yeah, you connect to your data, you just connect to cognitive search and then go to the PDF files. It's like, okay, yeah. And then, in 1993 terms, okay, now you have a web page. What are you going to do with it, right? So,
How do you do that tuning?
yeah, it's a process that's evolving right now. It's not a very pretty process at this time. It's an actual file that you're creating in JSON format where you have the syntax of the prompts and then what's expected to be returned back. So I don't want to dive too far in there, but it's not for the reason that most people say. I think most people don't want to do it because there's an air of mystery, but for us, it's more because that's where we're spending a lot of our time right now in some of the IP work that we're doing. So I just want to be careful when I'm saying during the user group. But at this time, what you can do with OpenAI and with Microsoft is you can create JSON files that have mappings of what are essentially prompts to what should be returned to the prompts and for data. And as you can imagine, that can get powerful, right? You can imagine using that pattern for software architecture and all sorts of different ways. I would think.
When you feed it this
Yeah.
information, it's not retraining the model.
No.
Okay,
No.
So it's dealing with that in a different way.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Otherwise, I'm looking to say that'd be very expensive.
yeah. No, of course. Yeah, no, that's a misnomer. That and it's very typical of any hype cycle that when you first have that hype cycle, there's just so much buzz and you can't keep track of what is and what isn't, and everything sounds confusing. But then things start to settle down a little bit, and the aha moments go off, and I think we're just getting to that part now, and and seeing some of this, and really. What we've been telling people is the best way to do it is just dive in and just start doing it. Like the reason why, we've been invited to speak about this a lot, and it's for multiple reasons. One, we love sharing what we're doing, but we were one of the early folks to start working on real world use cases in healthcare, on the operations side of healthcare. And so what I've been telling people is, and you saw me, I started my presentation by saying, here's the GitHub repo, go get it. You can do this right now yourself, just like we did, because our philosophy is that's great, but we want to stay 6 months ahead, right? That's how we protect ourselves and be innovative, right? So I want to teach people how to do what we're doing because I want them to do it by themselves. And you know what? A lot of people will be able to, which is amazing. I hope we help a lot of small companies and small businesses and folks that that need that help, and they'll get it. They won't have to pay a thing for it. But the folks that are enterprise customers, that want, we have a team of what I would say are some of the top engineers on the planet for doing this stuff. If you want access to that, et cetera, we're gonna obviously charge those clients for that. So. But anyway, I apologize for that. I didn't mean to. I was trying to explain why we're so heads down into this, not sell my services. So I apologize if that sounded salesy.
But the word fine tuning is mentioning. We
Yeah.
kind of use it for changing the weights, but you're using fine tuning as a way of the data that is outputted, right?
Yeah, as far as I know, this may also be the extent of my knowledge, right? But as far as I know, that's not happening that I know of. I should be really clear about that. But Microsoft has been pretty clear, in their messaging as well. I can tell you that's another advantage of really digging into the source code here as well. Is like I felt like when I dug into this source code, it helped me to understand more like where the data is coming from. Like now, when I go into this, let me pull up the chat client because that's what we're talking about here. you know, when you first start looking, when you first open up ChatGPT and you see the conversations are being saved, what's the first thing that happened with everybody? The first place your brain went was, oh, is that going to be used for training? Is that data? You know, what's happening with that? Oh my gosh, it's saving my conversations, right? Especially because at that time, everything was so new. So a lot of people thought they were really talking to what was going to be a human in 6 months or something. You know what I mean? Things are getting a little crazy. But so anyway, yeah, I digress. I don't know where I was actually going with that. Oh yeah, so it can look confusing. But now if I go into the code and I see no what's happening there, and it makes sense from a computer science perspective that what's happening there is they're reading in from the vector database the conversations for that person, and the reason why they're doing it is because that's the state of a conversational app is the conversation. And a conversation can't be queried like we query a traditional database. Show me all records where this equals Jones, right? We can't do that with conversations. Conversations are much more nuanced. So we need to be able to look at them as a piece of vector data, and we need to be able to do a different type of query to find out if it's the right fit. And so diving into the code helps me to see that. So now I know, well, okay, that's really cool. That's fascinating from a software architecture, but it sure ain't retraining a model. At least not this code. And excuse the phrase, I'm having some fun with it here, but no, and so again, yeah, diving into the code really helps. Now, what I wanted to show you next is the we have to have an open mind with this, and even Microsoft acknowledges this, that there are going to be multiple models, multiple players, and we need part of the art going forward is how do we combine these models in an artful way so that we can make things even better, right? Whether that's better in healthcare, better in education, better in business. And so when I look at this from a software architecture perspective and somebody that's building software product, one of the first things I think is, okay, I need to have a plan B because this is great. But again, first, it's not agnostic. Like it relies on Microsoft search, right? So I'm taking dependency on search there. Second, there could be real fees associated with that, right? Depending on how I'm using that search service and capabilities. And so what you should note, and this is all in the GitHub repo, so I'm not going to pull up PowerPoint slides. I've just got one slide here. I'm just going to talk about it. But there are two other groups, projects, if you will, initiatives. There are many, but the two that have come up to the top and have evolved are there's one big project called LangChain and another one called Hugging Face. Hugging Face is more of a community. It's basically it's ended up being the de facto place where people are sharing all their PyTorch libraries and different modules for building LLMs and various different all the stuff that's literally being invented today. As people are rolling stuff out, and LangChain is similar. But it is also a community, but it has a very specific focus, and that focus is it's very similar to what Microsoft provides in the semantic-kernel, meaning that it's trying to give software architects guidance on using prompt engineering and prompts and LLMs as software architecture. And when I say prompt engineering, I don't necessarily mean prompt engineering, figuring out the best prompt to put together a DALL-E image. I mean, prompt engineering is in when something happens in my SAP database, how can I do a personalized message to a patient, for example, right? Like there's much more interesting use cases, in my opinion, anyway, somebody just in healthcare. So that's fascinating too. So those are the two communities. So what I found, and now you may just have to bear with me for 1 minute, because hopefully I have this article ready. And I may not. Well, okay. I'll have to make sure I have this ready. I'll put a link in the boot camp here, but maybe you can Google it because I don't think I have a link in here yet. But there is basically a blog post by Microsoft MVP that uses LangChain to connect to a SQL Server database. And they do it using something called SQL Agent, okay? And the part that I wanted to show you, so I can show you that code. So we have that, we've adjusted it and adapted it. Hold on just a second. Me. Do one. Let me just see. It's all right. I'm gonna have to change those after this. That sucks, but okay. So I inadvertently had our access for our dev environment, so we'll have to change that afterwards. But anyway, you can see here. So in the beginning of the notebook, we're setting up some stuff. This is the LangChain stuff, and then here's where we're setting up the stuff to connect SQL to OpenAI, and so this is where the bulk of the work is being done. And so essentially what you do is you set up your environment variables, and then what you can do is you create an instance of this SQL agent, and then the SQL agent can be used to query the SQL server. But what's really fascinating is it's not just like the ability to query data. It literally is the ability to query the server. So if you search for this blog post, and I'll put a link to it in the GitHub repo for folks that are watching this recording, it's really cool because it'll show you, and the notebook code is there. It shows you step by step how the model is going to SQL Server. It knows to go to the sysadmin table in the master database. It knows how to query and filter on only tables. And then it knows how, and then it found the Titanic table. And then it knew, it was smart enough that it knew that what the person was asking is how many rows are in that table. And then so it looped through and it counted and said, okay, there's 18 rows in the, I now know the answer. There are 18 rows in the Titanic table. So that's a really great, that's what I mean by prompt engineering. It's more prompt chaining. It's the engineering of the prompt, but also the chaining of the prompts together, right? And not just prompts that go to large language model, perhaps prompts that do other things as well. Right? So it's this idea of tying all of this stuff together.
But when you talk about LangChains, the in-between agents,
Yeah.
they are built for purpose built, right? So they know exactly what to do. They know the input output. So it's not like auto discovery kind of thing. They kind of know what to do. The agent is specific action is there.
So agent, I'm still diving into and researching. So agent has limitations as well. Like one of the things that concerns me about agent is just I have yet to uncover like who's doing the work and how serious is the initiative. I haven't even been able to find the source code to it yet. So it could end up being the greatest thing since sliced bread, for all I know. But I'm just not at a place where I can make not where I can make that decision yet. My guess is just like always, it's probably going to depend on use case. That there are going to be lots of use cases where you'll use one pattern over another. So then we have a platform that we've built over the past 10 years with the Dartmouth Hospital Group just up north of here. And our platform focuses on the operation side of healthcare. So we focus on things like tracking RVUs and compensation for providers. And that data can be used to produce the compliance reports that are needed for Medicare cost reports, et cetera, at the end of the year. And long story short, the data sets turned out useful over the past 10 years. Dartmouth loved it. They kept doing more and more. And we were at a point, though, where we were at this inflection point where we really needed to take the next step and start to enable it with some newer technology. Because it was all running on-prem. It was built SharePoint, SQL Server, running on-prem. I mean, in all fairness, a lot of these healthcare systems, they are running in private cloud or on-prem, but it needed to be refreshed. Let's just say that. And so we started this effort about 12 months ago, and we were accepted in the Microsoft Startup Accelerator for that effort. And interestingly enough, I think because Dr. James Weinstein, who used to be the chief medical officer at Dartmouth, is now the vice president of healthcare at Microsoft. And he was the one that actually requisitioned our project at Dartmouth. So it was really cool because I didn't have to sort of explain it, if you will, and that's even if it made it to his desk. But my point is that, here we are, we're sitting in this place where we've got to do this, upgrade. And then this was about a year ago, and then boom, OpenAI comes out, right? And we're partnered with Microsoft. I've been working with Microsoft for 30 years. We go out to Redmond. We teach some stuff to the Cloud for Healthcare team. They're a client of ours. We're a client of theirs. So I hear about this OpenAI stuff, and the wheels start turning. And now we've got to a point, here we are 9 months later, where essentially what we've done, and we're hoping to be able to demo this fall, starting next week, is our version of this is literally replaces the user experience for for the platform and the let me do this, and the app. So for example, one of the things we do is we track, like I said, the RVU data for providers. It's basically a metric that helps to make sure doctors are paid fairly across the country. It's a very important metric to them. Like, if you're a doctor at a hospital, the two things you remember when you were learning about intranets, and you learned like the very most popular thing on the internet was a lunch menu and the vacation schedule, right? Well, like third for doctors would be RVUs. That link to click on RVUs. And so, what we've started to build out through a combination of connecting to SQL, to fine-tuning, we start to build out, okay, how can we make it so that the folks that are managing compensation can just come up and ask, whatever it is, hey, what was the RVU for Dr. So-and-so for this month? What did they attest to? How much time did they spend training their department? How much time were they actually doing clinical work, right, versus admin work and education work? These are all really complex questions to ask and get answered across a large institution. And they usually involve big numbers, because the doctors and nurses usually typically account for about 75% of your expenses. That's true of most businesses. Your employees account for most of your expenses, but certainly in healthcare, for sure. So that's how we ended up where we are. So I hope that helps. I want to close on that note, because what I hope that does is it plants the seed on how you might start to look at this from a software architecture perspective, right? And get beyond the hype cycle that we were talking about. And what could you potentially replace? By the way, I don't mean replace for the sake of replacing. I think we should be able to find work streams that we can make 10x better with this new technology, right? So look for those 10x scenarios. That's what we're doing right now, by the way. We're working on small but real world use cases and operations and finance, and just figure out what is real, what isn't real. A lot of stuff doesn't work as way you would think it does. You can see where it will. In a couple of years, it'll be great. You know what I mean? Some stuff just doesn't, and other stuff's way better than you thought, right? So that's how I would close the presentation. Is if you are in the role of a software architect and healthcare technologies, to start to think of this as another tool that you have in architecting your applications. Cool. So with that said, I'll say goodbye to the folks online. We'll stop our camera here. And I'll go change my all this stuff.